And then Liz Cohen is an American artist known as a performance artist, photographer, and educator, and automotive designer. Her decades-long career focuses largely on the intersections of immigration, industry, labor, and women's representation in popular media. She currently teaches at Arizona State University and lives in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm pleased to have co-curated Café Pan-Soviético Americano along with MOCAD's assistant curator, M. Pofel. In addition to being the artistic director here, I'm also an artist. And I, along with M, are former students of Cohen at the photography department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. This exhibition has been years in the making. I first proposed it to MOCAD in 2018 when I was a curatorial fellow, and now 5 years later, I'm so proud to see it realized. Thank you, Liz. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm sure it's going to be a talk to remember.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jova. Thank you to MOCAD and to Liz for inviting me to be in conversation with you and for you all coming. Liz, this is so awesome to be here with you. We've known each other quite some time now. And what's so exciting about this work is really the debut of your ceramics and a new page in your massive body of work. And that word, the body, is so much a part of you, your work, and everything that flows therefore. And I think let's start there with you as an individual and just kind of lay out your background and how you made it here.
Well, first, I want to thank you for being here and having this conversation with me. It's been an honor over the years to see my work written about by you in such an insightful way, with such knowledge about cars and the body and womanhood and motherhood, and so you brought so much richness and understanding of my work. And I'd like to thank Jova and Anne and Lido and Liberty and the rest of the staff at MOCAD for making the exhibition possible. And Judith, who's over here, is a designer that helped with the bandanas and the cups and the whole identity of the exhibition. So I guess I'll start right here just talking about my family. This is a photograph of my father having his bar mitzvah in Colombia, in Medellin. He came from parents that were immigrants. He grew up in an Arabic and Spanish-speaking household. His parents were from Syria and Lebanon. And so he grew up as the kid of immigrants and was part of a very small, very Orthodox Jewish community in Medellin. And this is a picture of my mom, who this is her first communion, and she grew up mostly in Barranquilla, Colombia, to parents that were Colombian from the countryside. So her parents later moved to the city where my mom grew up because they wanted their daughters to be in the city, but they were farm people, really, ranchers. And my parents met in Bogota, Colombia, and by the time they were adults, these kind of religious trappings were much less interesting to them, and they were both very politically active, and my father was an active member of the Communist Party in Colombia. He was kicked out of college for it, and he was very proud that in 1959, after the revolution, well, it's a continuing project, but after the revolution, he went in 1959 to a gathering in Cuba and met Che Guevara, and that was something that was really important in my family folklore. And anyway, my parents came to the United States in 1971. They ended up in Phoenix, Arizona, and that's where I was born. And I grew up the child of immigrants. So I grew up in an immigrant household, and I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. And it was the 80s, 70s and 80s, and for those of us in the room that are of the right age, we remember the Reagan era and the drug war. And so all the message I got about my identity as a Colombian from the mass media was as a Colombian American, was very negative. When we'd go for the summers, the questions were always like, are you afraid? isn't it dangerous? Like, oh, Colombia. And I was going to Colombia and hanging out with my cousins. My parents were taking us to museums. We were seeing amazing gold work at the Museo del Oro in Bogota, or going to markets and seeing like beautiful champa pottery. And those were the things that were affecting my kind of knowledge of material culture. But also the dissonance between those narratives, the narrative that my parents had about Colombia and the narrative that the mass media had about Colombia. I think it was probably an important formative moment for me as an artist, because I became very media literate, I think, early, seeing that kind of dissonance, and then understanding the power of encounter, engagement, and disengagement. Like what happens when ideologies, nations, superpowers, the global north and the global south encounter each other, engage and disengage, and what that can look like. And so I became very interested in these geopolitical dynamics, and also just having family all over the world, really, and people that came from so many different places, and how ideas can come together and kind of explode into inventions, which you later really see kind of in my Tramontamino, this like space of invention where ideas collide. And so my earliest work really was documentary work, and this is work from a body of work called Canal that I worked on when I was living in San Francisco. This work I think spans from 1996 to 2000. My father's, some of my father's family had immigrated to Panama, so I also grew up spending time in Panama City. And it was a great place to think about this kind of relationship between the United States and Latin America, as Panama's independence was staged really by the US government to build the canal. And so I was hanging out in this fringe of the canal zone and the city on a street called Avenida 4 de Julio, or Avenida de los Mártires. That's like translates to 4th of July Avenue, or the Avenue of the Martyrs, depending on who you ask the name of the street. And I met this group of sex workers, this group of trans sex workers that were, most of their clients were US servicemen. And so to me that was a really interesting like intersection between an encounter, right? An encounter between nations, an encounter between people, an encounter between genders. And so I think that might be a good place to keep going.
Yeah, and I mean, back to this notion of the body, and then that kind of takes us forward into your next style of work, is where you took the idea of performance and then the idea of your interest in cars, right? And that leads us to the Tramontamino, which became such a labor of passion and process, because it wasn't that you grew up customizing cars, or like a kid like me from Detroit where everybody kind of knows a little bit of something about cars. This was a process that you had to seek out, and almost a craft that you had to pursue. And that ultimately led you here. Can you talk about that journey of making photos of people to building a car, and how that's part of a singular process?
Yeah, I mean, with the photos in Panama, I really, at a certain point, I started performing on the street with the folks that I was photographing, and I started to think a lot about the kind of critical issues of photography around voyeurism, and thinking about belonging, and the kind of impossibility for me to, while I had kind of some camaraderie with the people I was working with, at the same time it was like a masquerade. There were major components of our identities that were divergent, that made me want to work in a different way. And so I wanted to work on something where I could still encounter something that wasn't part of my role, but that I would have an opportunity to become a part of it through labor. So thinking about labor, I had been working with people that were laboring in the street, and then I thought about how I could labor to achieve something. And so I was in Berlin, and I bought a Trabant in 2002, and had it shipped to the Port of Oakland, and I worked at a lowrider shop called Worldwide Creations in Oakland for a year, and that was like my big immersion into lowrider culture. I had been going to shows and stuff, but that was like my deep dive in, and that shop was really like a make do with what you've got kind of shop. And then after a year, I took the car to Arizona with me, where I'm from, and started working in a shop, Elwood Body Works in Scottsdale, where I was there for 4 years, and that's where I really was almost like an apprentice, and I had the opportunity to design a car with Bill Cherry, who's from Flint, and he had designed cars for NASCAR, a really like amazing person, and taught me everything I know about cars. Mostly came from Bill, like in the just kind of extensive design and teaching me a lot about welding and holding tools, using tools. So that's where I got like a real crash course. But then I ran out of money. And I had to get a better job. And so I started looking for a teaching job. And my kind of requirements to myself were, you know, I had to go somewhere that it made sense for building this car. And my goal was to come to Detroit. It was like Detroit or bust. I wanted to come to the land of GM. I wanted to finish this car, which was like basically the story of this Trabantamino, is that it's this East German car becoming a US American car, and it's becoming a GM, it's becoming an El Camino. It's about this process of becoming, not about the arrival. And so through a friend, Mark Newport, who teaches at Cranbrook, he knew there was a job opening at Cranbrook, and he invited me to speak in Fibers. And I got to meet the director, and I applied for the job, and then I got to be here. And I got to work in incredible shops. So every shop I worked at was like graduating to a higher kind of fabrication level. And so this right here is actually the shop where I met you. And this is Custom Creations in Sterling Heights. And Harvey Ledesma and Don Roberts were kind enough to invite me in and let me work on this build plate. And so this shop, when I got to Sterling Heights, was really a machine. I mean, it was a machine shop. And it was all about precision. Like being on this build plate was making sure everything was square. And I learned a lot about machining, and I had a different kind of advice. And it was kind of the place where the car got refined. And then after that, I finished on the car in the private garage with Al Sharp, who was at that time at EMI Experimental, which is a shop that does prototypes. I know they did the early Tesla prototypes. It's like a great person that like let me into his world and kind of helped me really get to the finish line, because I really was like, it was a 10-year long haul, and then I got like this push from Al. He was like, let's get you over the finish line. And so, yeah, so I had like an amazing kind of run with shops here, and learned, you know, all about like Detroit and a lot of the history of labor here. And I was at the shop. I was actually at Custom Creations during 2008 during the Great Recession, and so that was also seeing so many of their friends that were laid off from the big automobile companies coming in and hanging out and sometimes doing smaller jobs, and seeing people that were just like so inventive. Like I remember this one guy, Marcel, who would always come by, who had worked in the design center at GM, had started a business cultivating fancy lettuces for restaurants. But his whole greenhouse was warmed through radiators, and it was like all car technology. He had used some stuff he had around to grow gourmet lettuce. And it was just like, it was kind of an amazing time to be in the car world here, really, and seeing how people were reorganizing their lives.
Yeah, and I guess that puts us at when we met, which was 2010.
Yeah.
And we really started to show the Trabantamino, and it started moving from this place of the shop to the gallery, right? But I got to visit the shop, and what was so great is how I met Liz was in the context of writing for the automobile section of the New York Times. So it was unusual to cover a contemporary artist working in a pages where you would read about, you know, the next new vehicle you went on. And we, but what was so interesting about the way we met is that it was very technical, and we talked. I mean, Liz truly is an automotive customizer. I mean, I would put her up there with many of her peers at this point. So she has become that as part of her artistic practice. But I might, you know, ask her advice on how to fix a car at some point too, or how to add a little bit of chrome. But in addition to that, I think what struck me about the work was I felt a strong sense of identification with it, and I think that's where our relationship kind of evolved also, because I'm also an immigrant daughter of an immigrant, and share a strong connection to Central Europe and the Cold War era as the granddaughter of an Auschwitz survivor who went back to East Germany. And the first time that I visited East Germany was 1990, 91, and saw the Trabants on the street as people were driving them around. And for those who don't know, the Trabant was each kind of Soviet bloc region had its own vehicle, and the Trabant was associated with East Germany, and that's all anyone drove who lived there. And so Liz's fascination with that era was, it was something I hadn't really seen explored, and especially within the context of our town here, Detroit, which is where we're thinking so much about how to put our lives back together, especially in that time period in 2010, really trying to understand how do we move forward, and this kind of interesting relationship between Detroit and East Germany that continues to be talked about today. But I guess what I would like to talk to you about now, thinking back on that time, how did you first become so interested in exploring these ideas in your work? Because we see some of this in your photography, but this is such an investment of time and energy and really years of your life, right? So where did that kind of passion to pursue this kind of investigation come from, the research that supported it?
I mean, I feel really fortunate. My parents wanted us to see the world when we were kids, and they took us to the Soviet Union in the 80s and to China. And again, like the dissonance between the stories about those places I was hearing at home and then what I encountered in person. But then also all the material culture around the Cold War, how these stories were being telegraphed to the world and to me, and how beautiful some of that material is, you know, like the kind of language of different cultures showing values, right? You know, the pinup is a very Cold War, you know, artifact. It's part of, you know, the visual culture of the Cold War. You can think of Russian constructivism as like, and you know, the propaganda and all these kind of like shapes and typefaces and the body and the way women were reflected in kind of Soviet propaganda as these like strong laborers. And then, you know, I just was really interested in all this iconography, and then the Trabant obviously is like such a big symbol of all that, you know. And I guess maybe we might skip around a little here, but I don't know why this is asking me for this information here. Okay. But this image right here, I guess, to say a little bit about the kind of parallels, I think, between what was going on in the United States and what was going on in the former East Germany. So this is the Trabant factory in Zwickau, Germany, and it was originally the August Porsche factory, which was like the equivalent of Ford. And in the 50s, that Porsche sign was pulled down, and this became the Trabant factory. The Trabant sign was put up, and for 30 years, they produced, I think, like 30,000 cars. There were, you know, this was for me a tribute to all the people that worked there, that suddenly their lives turned around. After the wall came down, the car was produced for a couple more years with a Volkswagen Polo engine, and then it just didn't make sense anymore, and the factory closed, and there was this kind of post-industrial condition in the Sachsenring, in this kind of part, this industrial part of the former East. And it looked a lot like what I was seeing in Detroit. You know, I shot these when I lived here. It was right when I got here. I went, because I was thinking about this, kind of seeing this kind of post-industrial condition in the Midwest and understanding the kind of impact that had on like real people that work there and lost their jobs. And so, I don't know, I think I'm not really answering the question, but
I think you answered it.
Yeah,
I think I mean, because like, it's the within this relationship that there are not always these clear boundaries, and I think, as you said in your work, you're exploring the contrast within the similarities and where the fine lines, where's the fine line that you can cross, kind of cross pollinate.
Yes, and that project also had, these really heavy topics, but also this lightness and joy to it too, because the thing about it is the Trabants they're also kind of cute, right? Like they have the form language is, the symmetry is, it's not aggressive. And then when you combine that with the performance of of making it a lowrider, right? Which with the hydraulics, where it actually does something beyond drive, right? And I remember the first time that you demonstrated it, I think I saw you do that in New York City, and just the competence that you had, but the joy that people had in engaging with it. And it was such a topic that was, it was a way to talk and think about ideas that maybe aren't so easy to discuss. And then on top of that, then there's the relationship to the photography that you made that went alongside of it, which was really part of your process in thinking about performance and the performance of making of the car, of documenting the process of the tools, of the years and hours that you spent going through the process of making things, and then making yourself into this idea of mechanic, model. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that element of the work?
Yeah, I mean, there were different ways that I could try to belong, and so building the car was one of them, and then being the representative of the car as the pinup was another. But then again, it was also really, I think, motivated by all these different images of women, I think, that were portraying these kind of Cold War conflicts, so you have the pinup, you have the industrial, you have Rosie the Riveter, you have the industrial Russian woman, you have, I just remember the Olympics playing out when I was a kid, and it's funny, I conflated this. These are like childhood memories, but they happen at different times. But in my mind, Nadia Comaneci and Mary Lou Retton competed against each other. I don't think that was possible. But in any case, to me, those are two really big Cold War things for me. And the Woman Spy and all the Cold War movies, there was always in Gotcha or whatever, there was always this woman who was the spy. And so I think all of these images of women and being able to play one of them was pretty exciting to me, and I was quoting, I was playing, and I think I was also pushing against, I think there's always been, this fraught discourse around the body and performance for women, and just whether we embrace our sexual energy or suppress our sexual energy. And anyway, so that was all part of it.
And even the physical process to arrange this, what was that like? Just this work as a symbol for some of your other work. Tell me about that.
How it happened?
Yeah.
So I got a little grant from the museum school where I had gone to undergrad. They have a traveling scholars grant. I applied to go to this factory, and I through some friends, I got a producer and a person to be a camera operator and someone that would help me find props that were my little team. And then I went shopping in Berlin for some things that I thought looked East German in some way. I brought some things too, I brought that bikini with me. And then I had this connection with these guys in Plauen, which is another city in the former East, who were my part suppliers for the Trabant. So I called them up and I was like, do you think you could get me a Trabant and bring it to Zwickau? And they were like, sure, so they brought this Trabant, and they brought me the whole series has a lot, it's inside the factory too. They brought me a lot of Trabant parts that we put everywhere. And, but when I got to Zwickau, I couldn't find I went to the museum and I asked them where the factory is, and they were like, oh, doesn't exist anymore. It was knocked down. But I knew it wasn't true. I saw it on Flickr. And so then now I think it's hilarious that I didn't pre-plan every aspect of this, but it's probably for the better, or it wouldn't have happened. So I just started driving around looking at the skyline and looking at this photo, and then I found it. And there was next door, you can see this like white building that was some other kind of like small factory. And so they were like, yeah, you can just go in, you know? And it was amazing. We found the last ledger of like where the final Trabants went. It was amazing. I mean, it was like a time capsule, and then there was some storage in there or whatever. And we got the longest extension cord you've ever seen, like on a big barrel, that we ran from that factory next door up to the 4th floor window. So we had like so we could use the strobes, and so we shot on every floor of the factory. It was so much fun. It was a crazy shoot. It was hilarious. And so anyway, that's how that one happened.
You have so many amazing stories about your work. I think the process is always so interesting and fun, right? Like seeing you in the machine shop. I mean, the first day I met her, she had grease smudged all over her face. Like you looked like you belonged there 100%. And here, but then that's your body, right? And in your work, your body plays a role. Other folks' body plays a role. And often that body is the gender becomes a part of that concept, right? And your work, as even talking with some of your students, your former students, that's something that they have taken away from you as a teacher, the kind of this history and notion of performance and photography and the relationship there. And it's something that, you could, that I feel like I would want to hear a little bit more about that from you. Like what does that mean in your work then, and how does that carry over into the work that we're going to get into in this exhibition?
So I guess I'll give like a little context. So I went to college in the 90s. When I went to college, like in terms of like things that were going on around the body, like George Bush the first was president, then Bill Clinton became president, but it was just a time of these pro-choice, pro-life confrontation rallies. Clarence Thomas became confirmed to the Supreme Court. Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton had an encounter that I don't even know how to characterize. And so anyway, that was a kind of like a context of just to give you like an idea of like what was in the discourse, what was in the air when I went to college. And I think that the kind of conversation, there was a lot of conversation around being sex positive. So that was like another thing, But I think like still even today, the discourse around women's bodies and how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to look, if we're considered empowered, how we're supposed to perform as artists. I think it's interesting to me, I think the conversation from like the whole post-war conversation up until now hasn't changed that much around what some people would call sexualization of the body, which has like a negative connotation, like don't sexualize yourself, to embracing like a full spectrum of what a woman's body could be or could feel or experiences in the world. And so I was very interested in embracing kind of my femininity and sexual energy, which I have a friend here from my San Francisco days, Gina, who is actually probably laughing because I was so kind of like boyish and not any of these things when I was a young artist. But in any case, I put this image up here because this is from that series I did in Panama, and this person in the photograph with me is named Lynette, and this is from a night she convinced me to let her dress me up. I had really short hair, I had hairy legs and armpits, and she was like, she was the one that was like trying to convince me to embrace my femininity. She convinced me to let her dress me up. She walked me around to some windows, like to imitate mannequins and show me how to pose, and then she took me on the street with her that evening. And so I really credit Lynette with the person that really first introduced me to performance, because it wasn't anything that was on my mind. I was really doing street photography, honestly. I was doing street photography, and then this happened. And so it opened my world, and I started thinking a lot about Lisa Lyon, who was an artist who many of you may recognize from photographs that Robert Mapplethorpe took of her, where she was performing kind of herself. And Lisa Lyon, to me, was so interesting because she brought method acting to art. So she worked out for part of the time alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger. She worked out to become the first international women's bodybuilding champion. And it was a performance. She did it once. It wasn't like her career. And then she just had this incredible freedom, like her notion of what it meant to be a sexual being, of what it meant to be a performer, of what it meant to be a part of the art world. I just feel like she was totally irreverent, and she was in movies. And if you've never seen the movie Vamp, it's a vampire movie from the 80s. I so recommend it. She's in it, Grace Jones is in it, Keith Haring paints Grace Jones's body. I mean, whatever. She was in all these crazy movies and around all these amazing people, and she disappeared really from the public eye. And I think she just really retreated, and there was this kind of erasure. But she was someone that was a huge influence on the way I saw performance. And that's kind of what led me into doing the project with the Trabantamino, was this idea of becoming something. It's that idea of like method acting, and then suddenly being what the thing is that you're trying to imitate. And then Hannah Wilke was another artist that was a really big influence on me, and the kind of criticism she got, again, for like embracing her sexual energy and using her body, and critiquing certain kind of feminist ideas that weren't working for her, that weren't like liberating to her, and creating her own brand of it, and also just, I see both Lisa Lyon and Hannah Wilke as people that went through a lot, and so if you know the arc of Hannah Wilke's life, she later became ill, and she makes work through her illness until her death. But then we were just talking, and I was saying I was like so saddened and shocked, but not so shocked, that when Klaus Oldenburg passed away, in the obituary in the New York Times, they left out Hannah Wilke and that whole chapter of his life where they were together. And I thought that was just like another interesting kind of like, anyway, I'm interested in all those things, like who's in, who's out, what does it mean to be in, how are you in, how do you play, what's playful, what's a reenactment of trauma, how does the body, like that's another thing I really learned when I was in Panama, photographing, like this idea that the gesture and the body and the performance could actually be a re-performance of an encounter that could include pleasure and pain and violence. And so that's kind of.
And I think that's a great point to talk about the work that's in the other room and the gauze, like how it fits in, how the work is all in conversation, the ceramics, the vehicle. Talk about, and the irony of it also, that this work is showing just blocks from Diego Rivera's, like really such an interesting place and space to show it in Detroit. And I would love to hear how does that project come to you? How is it a deepening of these themes that we've been talking about, of Marxism, of the post-Soviet era, of the body? Let's talk about that.
So again, like an intersection of like women's body in the Cold War, a little family story that started out as a kernel of something that was just a curiosity. My mom learned how to drive on one of these Gaz vehicles, and I just was trying to figure out why the Gaz was in Colombia and why my mom crashed into a tree with this car, So I just started digging online, and it wasn't so easy to find anything. And then I found a line in like on Google Books and some book about economic trade in Latin America. So basically, and then I started digging deeper. But the story is that after the Cuban Revolution, the Cold War got very chilly between the Soviets and the rest of Latin America, and their only source of coffee was really Cuba for the whole Eastern Bloc, and people really wanted their coffee, and so there were the coffee uprisings, and so people went to the street and they protested asking for coffee, and so the Soviets understood they had to do something, and so they made this trade deal, which was actually brokered through GM, Colmotores, which was GM in Colombia, of cars for coffee. And then these cars came to Colombia along with other Eastern Bloc cars. But as I dug into the history of the Gaz, it just became like I couldn't get enough because it was such a crazy history. Henry Ford, so this is post-Bolshevik Revolution. Henry Ford goes to Russia to help start the gas factory. Albert Kahn builds a building. I mean, it's like there's so much Detroit in the Gaz. It's incredible. And then the engine in this Gaz is a Dodge inline engine, which they bought the design from Dodge for $14, the equivalent of $14. And so all those connections then about that encounter, and then all these things that countries still do together because they're practical, right? We have the face, we have like the propaganda, whatever, and then behind the scenes, all these people are working together, moving goods and services and ideas and technologies. And so I was also really interested in this encounter between the superpowers in Latin America. So like in this work with Panama, I'm very interested in this encounter between the United States and Latin America. And with the Trabant, you know, when I'm working in turning it into a lowrider, it's this kind of Cold War experience of what the Cold War and what World War II brought to Latinx communities in the United States through the hydraulic technology on the planes, through the pinups, and all that stuff kind of comes from a Cold War moment. And then this piece is really about this kind of Soviet encounter with Latin America and the kind of ideas that were brought and the ideas that were shared and how it kind of affected Latin American identity, really.
I think this is a good point, though. So we have the foundation of the ideas. I think it's a great point to show how this vehicle made it here, which is an interesting story in itself and kind of speaks to this notion of performance in your work, where the performance is person wants vehicle, person has to locate vehicle, which means mining internet forums, obscure car collectors, and then finally locating a Gaz in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, so I wanted to get this car. I was looking online. It's COVID era, 2020. I couldn't really go to Poland to go buy one. So I called you. I wrote the folks at the Peterson Automotive Museum. I wrote the folks at the Venda Museum. I wrote the people who used to have the Spy Museum. I wrote like everyone. I'm like, hi, my name is Liz Cohen, and I am looking for a Gaz 69A. And then I started to get tips. And then I ended up in Seattle at the Soviet Car Museum, which is a bunch of basically climate-controlled containers that this guy has that has every Eastern Bloc car that was ever made. I mean, it's the most amazing thing. He takes them out once a year. And so we talked, and your friend Keto Brillmeyer met me out there, and he's a motocross. I mean, maybe you should say something about him before I play these videos, because it was like so fun to get to meet someone that was helping me check out the car and that could understand it in a way so that I was like, knew what I was, you know, this is how I do it. I talk to people and I learn things, and you'll see a little bit in the video.
Yeah, a quick word about Keto is that he has devoted his life to rally, to thinking about car from a motorsports perspective, but really in off-roading, but also in custom builds as well, and in engines is really his strong point. And so he was kind enough, I believe, to make a cameo in this video that you're going to show.
So this little video, I just to show a little bit about like how I learn about cars and like the encounter with people. This is a video at this place outside of Seattle where I'm about to buy the car, and there's a Russian guy in the car explaining to us how you shift this car, and Keto explaining to me that kind of like older technology. So let me, oh wait, we need to be in this view. Screen, here we go. I don't know why this doesn't have any sound. Well, we don't have any sound here.
Well, I think what you can see is this man demonstrating in, I don't know, not quite clear terms from my read of it, of how this vehicle works, and then Keto kind of breaks it all down.
And explains it. And then I'll show you another video where you can just see like how this car drives in the test drive. Keto's in the back seat videotaping, and I'm with Alex, who was working for the Soviet Car Museum.
And that's you driving.
Yeah, and this is the test drive. You can see how smooth the ride in the
Yeah.
Gaz is. And so this car, the technology is so, it's just like a very practical, simple car. It's very, I don't know if the right word would be primitive, but it has a push start. So this is a car built in the 60s. You can, when you look at it, when you go back there, you can crank start it from the front. It has a push start, it has a choke. You have to double clutch when you're shifting the gears. It's, you know, it's, the technology is definitely from another era, and it's a very practical car.
Yeah, we were chatting with a car designer yesterday. It was really functionality at its utmost, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no frills here. It was made to be low cost and really kind of, it went way beyond the Soviet Union. We're even hearing about gases.
Yeah, it was like produced in other countries. So the Soviets would give the license to other countries. There was a factory in Yugoslavia. There was a factory in Romania. We met a guy from Nigeria last night, and there was one of the dealerships a block away from his house when he was a kid. So this car, you know, made it around the world, or at least the global south.
And your Gaz is going to do a bit of a world tour. Let's talk about where you are at in the lifespan of the Gaz. Like when you called me, that there was much more than just by vehicle. There was a whole,
Yeah.
as you can see in Liz's work,
Yeah. Let me.
depth upon depth.
Yeah. So basically, this is the very beginning of another big build. So. So right now, I would say that the Gaz is kind of a ready-made with a small modification. It has a tray in it with an espresso machine, and it's really, you know, a nod to that trade deal Cars for Coffee. But eventually, the car will be about it'll be about 4 inches longer, and the area where you see the kind of extra gas can. That gas can will be made larger, and it'll be kind of like an origami thing that you open, and that's where you get your caffeine, your other fuel. And then there'll be a tailpipe that spits out coffee grounds. So when you want to grind the coffee for your espresso, the coffee has to take a dump. And my idea is really to visit. So as I got deeper into researching this car, its relationship to coffee, and women's relationship to coffee, I found out that over 70% of the people that work in agricultural production of coffee are women. And there's a saying on coffee farms that without women, there's no coffee. But you know, all the iconography around this, really around coffee growing, at least as someone coming from a Colombian background, is Juan Valdez and his donkey Conchita, who carries the sacks of coffee. And so part of what I want to do is drive this car down the Pan American Highway and visit women's coffee co-ops, photograph women in coffee, and kind of produce a counter iconography for kind of to Juan Valdez, and also to have conversations around labor over coffee. And so right now, in this stage of the car, the build, what I'm enjoying is really interacting with what is going on with coffee in the United States, and how young people have been, well, young and old people have been organizing at Starbucks and here in Detroit at Great Lakes to unionize different stores. So the first event with a coffee worker that I did was at the mattress factory in Pittsburgh, and we worked with a young woman, Tori, who had organized her Starbucks, was fired, and began to work with Workers United. And she did an event where she read a manifesto and served her signature drink called the Tory. And we're lucky that we're working here with Liberty, who I don't know if you encountered her by the Gaz, serving the Gaz's signature drink, which is the Raf, which is a tropicalized Russian coffee drink. So in Russian coffee houses, there's a very popular drink called the Raf. It's kind of a latte made with cream. And oftentimes it's like lavender or vanilla, and so to tropicalize it, I just changed that to anisette. And so the car is serving that. Liberty serves that drink every other week here for the duration of the exhibition, and then we will on May 20th do an event with Liberty where she will read her manifesto and serve the Liberty signature coffee drink, which you'll see sounds amazing. And so anyway, that's kind of some of the ideas around the car. And
Well, and anyone who sort of follows car culture, there's this idea of these weekly meetups that are called Cars and
Yeah.
Coffee. And I think yours has a bit more depth to it. But I think, we're getting towards the end, but I think it's really important to talk about the ceramics and the relationship to the gauze and your work. And I think it is a really beautiful way to kind of go back to the beginning of the story, right? Like your origins, who you are, how you came to look at visual culture, the role that Colombian culture and history plays in your work, and this constructivist idea of using materials. And let's talk about what's back there and where it comes from, how you got this done so quickly.
so I thought it was just important to show this image. So again, I grew up like with my parents talking a lot about this gold work. And my mom, every time we'd go to Colombia, she would get replica pieces of jewelry for herself. And it was like, this gold was like a thing to be very proud of. And we would go to the Museo del Oro in Bogota. And this is a piece that I remember seeing at that museum, which is this, to me, it's like a spaceship. It's like an intergenerational spaceship. And there are these people on it, and they're just ready to travel anywhere across time, across seas, across the universe, So that was how I saw this. And this was a really big influence. This and the chamba pottery that I showed in the beginning, the kind of black ceramic ware, along with kind of constructivist shapes and forms. If you think about like Tatlin is someone I've thought about since undergrad, actually, and the monument to the Third International and the kind of shapes and the off-kilter things, and even thinking about, it doesn't fit in as much, but like I do care about the Bauhaus and Oscar Schlemmer and the ballet, and I feel like you can feel all those things in there. But you'll see in the exhibition with the ceramics, you'll see the trays and you'll see the figures, and then I just I moved that into thinking about the women and coffee and this kind of intergenerational knowledge being passed along, and knowledge around art, agriculture, and the kind of encounters that happen around commodities, right? So around gold, which is a very early commodity and an early form of trade, and then which had very different meanings to different people. To a conquistador, gold meant something very different than to someone making an object that might have been very ceremonial and very meaningful and sacred. And then there's the commodity of coffee. Again, these are like the world's biggest commodities. Coffee, I think, is the world's biggest third largest commodity. And the encounters that happen with the trade with coffee between the global north and the south, and labor and money and agriculture prices and the environment, and all these things, how these encounters change people's lives. And then you have like gold, then you have the agricultural revolution, then the industrial revolution, which really is like this kind of petroleum heavy culture, and thinking about like cars and grease and oil and all those kind of things come into the ceramics somehow in different ways. I hope you can see it.
Can you bring
so
the
here's
image
some
up?
of the ceramics here. So these are my revolutionary gals hanging out on their tray, traveling through generations, talking about power, coffee, pain, aging. They're really old. These ones are ancient. They've got some age on their bodies.
Yeah, and it's back to the women's body, and that our bodies are not commodities, right?
Yeah.
And can you talk about some of the iconography?
Yeah, I mean, you can see the kind of you can see the coffee bean come through, and just kind of some of the shapes that come from kind of constructivism, and then also as someone who's used my body to perform in my photographs. I think I just turned 50, and I think like being around this age, just thinking a lot about the changes in my body and how I want to use my body in my work. I recently did a body of work kind of embodying Lisa Lyon with a lowrider icon, Daza Del Rio, because we're both around the same age, and like kind of feeling weird about our bodies and bikinis, and we're like, we're gonna do it. We did it. But so anyway, I'm also thinking about just gravity. and weight. And I think you can see that on the chests of these gals. which also I feel like have references even to like automotive tabs and stuff. I feel like there's just like an industrial kind of reference in the shapes and thinking about the gold and the sacred and how our bodies kind of come from a sacred place and not a place of commodity, although we can use our bodies for economic gain, you know, so that it's just like that's the thing. Our bodies are, they can be tools and they can be something else, right? And so
that's the duality in your work, right? It's questioning that, and at what point do you take agency?
Yeah.
Is this a good place to open it up for questions?
Yeah, sounds great.
Do we have any questions?
I see someone in the back. Oh, hi, Anthony. Good. I'm happy to see you here.
Sort of what was brought up. Oh, thank you. That will help a little. Ooh, that's very loud. I think you had sort of, there was a comment about an essay that was written about your work that was actually in the automotive section. As for me, particularly interesting in how that sort of transcends these sort of maybe cultural boundaries of art, you could say. And I just wanted to know if perhaps you could respond to that thought.
Thank you for the question. I mean, again, I guess like I'm processing the question and thinking about one of the things that came to my mind as you were talking was this, like, I mean, I was the kid of immigrants and there was all this exchange of culture, and my father was the child of immigrants, like, you know, so there was just like, there was so much movement, I think, in my family and stories from, you know, like life before the Ottoman Empire fell, you know, and so I think like that notion of cultural exchange and like the freedom to move and to learn from people and to have like kind of genuine interaction, I think that was part of how I grew up. So I think it wasn't like a huge stretch for me, I guess, in a way. But then I'm glad you mentioned that moment in San Francisco, because we were there during a really interesting and vital time. And I'm just thinking of the landscape and thinking that when we were in school, Larry Rinder was the director of the WADIS, and I remember he walked into my studio, and it was like I had just come back from Panama after Lynette had taken me out on the street, and I had this little video in my studio, and I hadn't shown it to anybody, and he saw it, and he's like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Oh, nothing," you know, and he's like, no, let me see that. And it was like me reenacting, getting makeup put on by Lynette. He's like, "Do more of that." And I really, you know, it was like having someone there like Larry to kind of give me the freedom to open up, because, you know, I was studying in the photo area, which was really a very photo program. I was studying with Larry Sultan, who was an incredible artist, photographer. But then, you know, there were also people around like Harold Fletcher and John Rubin, which were performing as Fletcher and Rubin. I don't know if they would even call it performing, but they were doing what wasn't termed social practice yet, but they were doing kind of documentary works where they would encounter people and they would look at all their objects, and they would do an exhibition with their objects and have the person do something in the exhibition. And it was kind of wild in this idea that that art isn't always in the museum, like that the art can be somewhere else, you know? And so I think that was really a part of our time there. And so I did a bikini car wash when I lived in San Francisco. And then when I moved to Arizona, and even when I was at the shop in Oakland, I actually considered those the site of the work and the exhibition of the work. Like the work was being produced there, but it was also happening there. Like that's where the art was being exhibited, was at the shops. So yeah, it was I'm glad you brought that up because it really was formative, like just the way we were thinking and the way we were all interacting with each other and just kind of bouncing ideas and ways to make art. And it was an amazing moment.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Something that I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about, which is, I'm trying to figure out how to fold two questions into one. One, I think the question is really about time, right? So when we were talking about doing the show, we obviously know we're in a wartime right now and what that sort of means to present this work that is about something that seems very far away but maybe isn't. And your sort of trajectory as an artist, right? And thinking about time and how these kinds of works takes years, decades almost to complete, right? And the sort of vulnerability of not showing any photography, but putting your body on the line in another way that's not through photograph, through whether it's ceramics or customizing a car, etc. And I'm just wondering if you can share with the group, because I know we've talked about it, but I think it would be nice for folks to hear what it means for you to be presenting this kind of work in this current climate that we're in.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's like kind of like a whiplash, it's like Russia was like the enemy in the 80s, and it's like still the enemy. I mean, we're having the same conversations, and I mean, there's so much sadness to it. There's nothing good about war, there's nothing good about war. It's like, people in powerful places having conflicts with each other, and then regular people ending up dying because of it. So I don't know really how much more that I can say about the situation in Ukraine besides that it's just like horrific. And then just all the rhetoric around it, I think all of us need to be, media literate, and I'm sure we are, but like the stories that we hear, and it's very interesting to see like the way we can catch glimpses of the discourse around the war in the global south and the discourses around the war in Europe. Macron was just in China, and he came back speaking about Taiwan, saying we're basically not the puppets of the US, like Europe will have its own identity. So, I mean, there's nothing right about what's going on in Ukraine, so don't take it that way, but it's just the hypocrisy that we have when we're a country that's invaded Iraq or whatever. Like, it's just so interesting the way we talk about these things and our moral indignation when we're just as violent, and deeply violent, So, I mean, it's just, I know the work doesn't totally touch on what is happening right now, but I do hope it's like a reminder for people to reconnect historical moments to human beings and to regular people that aren't in power, that aren't in office, that don't hold high positions, that their lives just get swept over by politics or by, these changes, and it's what happens. Yeah. Hi.
So you've worked in so many different places. I wonder if you have noticed anything specific to the art that's done here in Detroit or in Michigan.
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I worked at Cranbrook for 9 years as an artist in residence, so I have like a couple of versions of what Detroit is, but like the history of art in Detroit that I was like most deeply informed of, really happens at Cranbrook, and with the history of the arts and crafts movement and this kind of like materiality, like this understanding of material and design and these ideas around modernism and the idea that everybody can have good design. I think Cranbrook moves through those ideas. And then there were other things happening around, the history of industry in Detroit. And I think a lot about like even Diego Rivera coming here, and we have this amazing, mural at the DIA. And I think about even like Frida Kahlo being here at the same time, and her loss of a child, of a pregnancy, and all the dynamic between her and Diego, and how we even think about like that moment here and in the history of Detroit's art history. I don't know how big freed up pictures in it. But there's so much to say about the history of art in Detroit. I don't even think I can begin to scratch the surface. But really, I was very influenced by that history that happened at Cranbrook, because I was really there, living there, immersed in this kind of like beautiful, I don't even know how to describe it. This beautiful cloister.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi.
Hi.
Speaking of Cranbrook, one of the things that really dawned on me, like we've worked together. I'm the curator at Cranbrook, and we've done a show together. But when you talk a lot about the body, but I started thinking about the hand and the skilled hand within your work, and in part how you move within these different sections of culture, but you're also doing that within the art making world. I mean, when we were working together, you were at the loom at Cranbrook for like a year, and then I find out you're like, and now I'm making ceramics. So I'm just curious about like, how do you think in part from moving from photography into something like building the car has then made this almost obsessiveness and like I have to make something with my hands?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the places where I get a lot of pleasure, making art, is through figuring out things through making them, right? And so, I mean, like with the car, it's kind of hard to believe now, but with the Trabantamino, like the original idea for the Trabantamino is nothing like the car ended up being. And that was like learning and doing as I was going along, and it looked completely different than I ever expected it to. And I thought it was gonna be a performance artifact. I didn't realize I was making something that was like a sculpture that would actually be like visually refined, like something that would be refined, And so I think that moment when I saw the Trabantamino, like in its first era of being done, I mean, a custom car is never done, but like in the first era that I could say it was presentable, I was like, shocked me, and it was like, wow, can make something. But then also I just think the pleasure of like learning, I mean, it's the technology of it, but I think there's also something about folk art that, like, I think cars and photography, like the kind of industrial arts, have a lot to do with like folk knowledge and passing knowledge around to people and working together and learning things. And photography has become so accessible through the phones, and like everyone can take a beautiful photograph. There's so many amazing, gorgeous photographs in the world that the currency is really now, like for me, where I get my jazz is through ideas, right? So they can kind of manifest themselves anywhere. I mean, like making images brings me a lot of satisfaction too with the camera, but the process with the clay, I mean, it's so different than the loom. I'm processing as you asked the question. Because the loom, it was like I designed things, I had a learning curve, but then I designed things, and then it was like very meditative. It's like a very tedious, slow, like meditative process, but there's something amazing about like seeing it as it's happening, And then with the ceramics, clay is very responsive, but then it's also, you have to let go of some kind of control. Every time it gets fired, something different happens, and it's like a surprise. I'm sure for people that have more experience, it's less of a surprise, but for me, they were big surprises. And those surprises change the direction and the aesthetic of the work. But yeah, I get great pleasure out of like spending that time learning, and I think I get pleasure out of a time crunch and like a giant production and pressure. I like pressure. And research, yeah. And I geek out on learning about things. Like, so, Laura, you know this well, like all my black and white little laser printouts on the wall. It's the same with the ceramics, like me just looking at things I like very intuitively, like not trying to make it, like there's the part that's very historical and geeky, but then there's just me like surfing around looking at ceramics and like doing weird searches and just printing out things that I like, and then just having like a wall of images in front of me of things that I think have a certain energy that makes sense to what I'm working on, and it's like there's no way to verbalize it. I think you know what I mean. Yeah. So yeah, it's like research, the hand, like folklore, meeting people, making images, history. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you so much, Tamara, for coming out. Thank you to everyone. My name's Lito Rankin. I'm the programs manager here. I want to invite you into the Gaz space. Liberty Moore will be back there. She was part of the Karmas and Coffee movement here. And actually, Liz and Liberty will be in conversation here on May 20th. So if you head back into the Gaz space, she'll be activating the espresso machine. She's making a delicious drink called the RAF. Please enjoy. Thank you.